Fame has a way of creating illusions, and for this artist, the illusion was almost flawless. To the outside world, they were the definition of success. Sold-out shows, headlines that crowned them as the voice of a generation, and an image polished enough to convince anyone that they had it all figured out. But the truth, the real story hidden beneath the lights, was nothing like the glamorous picture painted for the public. Behind every photo op and viral moment was a battle, a scandal, or a secret that few dared to acknowledge out loud. And as their career rose higher, so did the shadows that followed them. People have always been fascinated not just by music, but by the chaos surrounding the ones who make it. We lean in closer when the story gets darker, when the rumors sound too wild to be true, and when the artist seems to be caught in a storm that could either destroy them or cement their place in history forever. That's exactly why this story matters, because it's not just about the songs that made them famous, it's about the whispers, the betrayals, the comebacks, and the controversies that turned one career into a saga. Every twist reveals something new, something that makes you question whether you really know who this artist is, or whether the entire persona has been one carefully constructed mask. And maybe that's why people can't look away, because deep down, we know fame doesn't just elevate people, it tests them, breaks them, and sometimes rebuilds them into something unrecognizable. The story of this artist is one of those rare ones where every rise is shadowed by a fall, every success hides a struggle, and every rumor carries just enough truth to make you wonder what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling. Every superstar has an origin story, but what most people don't realize is how often those beginnings are far from glamorous. For this artist, the early years were anything but easy. Before the fame, before the stage lights, before the world knew their name, there was a childhood marked by struggles that shaped the person they would eventually become. They weren't born into privilege, and the journey that led to global recognition was paved with obstacles most fans have never even heard about. Growing up, the environment around them was chaotic. Money was scarce, family dynamics were tense, and the idea of chasing a dream seemed almost impossible when survival itself was a daily battle. Friends from their neighborhood would later recall how determined they seemed even back then, how they carried themselves with a mix of confidence and defiance that didn't quite match their circumstances. And yet, beneath that exterior, they were dealing with challenges that could have easily broken someone else. Teachers often said they were different, a little too restless, a little too distracted, always scribbling in notebooks or humming melodies when they should have been paying attention. What most didn't see was that those scribbles and melodies were their way of escaping reality. While other kids were caught up in schoolyard games, they were sketching out verses and hooks, using music as an outlet for frustrations they couldn't put into words any other way. The struggles at home added another layer. Their family wasn't always supportive. To some relatives, music seemed like a foolish distraction, a pipe dream that would never amount to anything. There were constant reminders to be realistic, to focus on something stable, something safe. But stability wasn't in the cards for them. The tension often spilled into arguments that left scars deeper than anyone realized. In moments of silence, when the house was heavy with unspoken resentment, they turned to music again, writing late at night, whispering lines under their breath as if they were secrets too dangerous to say out loud. This duality, the pressure of their environment clashing with the pull of their creativity, became the crucible that forged their identity. It's no wonder their lyrics later resonated with fans who felt misunderstood, trapped or invisible, because they knew that feeling intimate, they had lived it. Yet for all the challenges, there were glimpses of resilience that set them apart early on. Even as a teenager, they weren't afraid to put themselves out there. Talent shows, freestyle battles, open mics, any opportunity to perform was seized, even when the crowd wasn't receptive. Rejection stung, of course, but instead of breaking them, it seemed to fuel them. Every no became a reason to push harder, to refine their craft until it was impossible to ignore. Some who saw those early performances didn't understand the drive. Why keep trying when the odds were stacked so high? But those close enough to witness the fire in their eyes knew there was something unstoppable there, something that wouldn't let them quit no matter how bleak the future looked. Rumors about their early years have circulated for years, stories of street fights, brushes with the law, and dangerous choices made out of desperation. Some of those stories have never been fully confirmed, but the whispers persist because they fit the picture of someone who was constantly fighting their way out of impossible circumstances. Fans often speculate that certain lyrics hint at those darker experiences, subtle references to nights spent in places no teenager should have been, choices that could have derailed everything before it even started. Whether those stories are completely true or not almost doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that they carried the weight of those experiences into their music, and listeners could feel the authenticity in every line. What makes their early life even more compelling is the balance between vulnerability and defiance. On one hand, there are accounts of quiet, solitary nights where they questioned whether they were good enough, whether chasing the dream was worth it, whether they'd ever escape the cycle that seemed to trap everyone around them. On the other hand, there were moments where they stood tall, refusing to bow to anyone's expectations, declaring in small but powerful ways that they were destined for something greater. That tension between doubt and determination became a defining trait, one that would later make their music relatable to millions who also wavered between hope and despair. It's easy to look at the fame and forget the foundation it was built on, but the truth is, those struggles never really left. They became the raw material for a persona that the world would one day see as unshakable. Even in the moments where they seemed larger than life, there was always that shadow of the past, a reminder that behind the fame was someone who had once been told they'd never make it. That shadow gave their art depth, and it gave their story weight. Fans didn't just hear catchy songs, they heard survival, resilience, and the echoes of battles most people never saw. Looking back, the irony is clear. The very circumstances that should have crushed their dreams became the fuel that propelled them forward. The instability at home made them seek refuge in music. The dismissive comments from adults made them hungry to prove everyone wrong. The rejections from early performances sharpened their edge until their talent couldn't be denied. Every struggle became a stepping stone, every obstacle a lesson in endurance. And though they would go on to face controversies and scandals on a much bigger stage, the roots of their resilience were planted in those early years. Without that foundation, their career might not have survived the storms that were yet to come. But as much as those early struggles forged strength, they also planted seeds of conflict that would later erupt in ways no one expected. The tension between vulnerability and bravado, the constant need to prove themselves, the scars of betrayal and disappointment, those would resurface time and time again, shaping not only their music, but their relationships, their choices, and ultimately their legacy. The childhood story wasn't just a prelude to fame, it was the blueprint for everything that followed. And as much as fans celebrate the victories, it's the struggles of those early years that explain the controversies, the reinventions, and the battles still being fought long after the spotlight found them. Because fame doesn't erase the past, it amplifies. And for this artist, the past was always right there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. The breakthrough moment every artist dreams about didn't arrive for this one in a neat package, tied up with instant recognition and overnight acceptance. It came like a storm, unpredictable and impossible to control, and while it opened doors that had once seemed locked forever, it also unleashed shadows that would haunt them in ways nobody could have prepared for. The story of their rise isn't the fairy tale people imagine when they think of viral success. It's more complicated, more chaotic, and far more revealing about how fame works when you strip away the polished surface. Their big break came with a single song, the one that spread faster than wildfire, not because the industry wanted it to, but because the people demanded it. Fans shared it, quoted it, and blasted it everywhere, until ignoring it became impossible. Suddenly, someone who had been grinding in obscurity for years was the name on everyone's lips. It seemed like the dream had arrived at last, but what no one realized was that this was the beginning of a whole new battle. The industry wasn't ready for them. Labels that had once turned them away now came knocking, pretending they had believed all along. Executives who had dismissed their demos suddenly called them a genius, but beneath the smiles and handshakes were contracts laced with traps, offers that looked glamorous on the surface but came with chains attached. This is the part of the story fans rarely see. The meetings in backrooms, the arguments over control, the realization that success doesn't always mean freedom. Fame, they learned quickly, was a trade: visibility for autonomy, applause for privacy, opportunity for ownership. And the shadows that came with it began creeping in almost immediately. Even in those first months of stardom, there was pressure to change. Industry insiders whispered about how they should dress, how they should speak, what parts of their story should be erased to make them more marketable. Their rough edges, the very authenticity that had drawn fans in the first place, was suddenly seen as liabilities. It was a tug of war between staying true to themselves and fitting into a mold that promised longevity. They fought back, sometimes subtly, sometimes loudly, refusing to be molded into someone they weren't. But every refusal came with consequences. Opportunities disappeared, allies turned distant, and whispers started circulating that they were difficult. The irony was sharp. An industry that had ignored them for years was now trying to reshape them, and when they resisted, it labeled them the problem. At the same time, the public's gaze intensified. Every word, every outfit, every appearance became fodder for analysis. Fans dissected their lyrics, tabloids speculated about their personal life, and bloggers picked apart their every move. The very song that had launched them became both a blessing and a curse, tying them to an image that was never meant to be permanent. People wanted more, but they also wanted consistency. They wanted the artist to grow but never change too much, to evolve but never risk alienating the audience that had fallen in love with the first version of them. That contradiction became a shadow all its own, one that followed them from stage to stage, a reminder that success often comes with invisible strings. What made things worse was how quickly rumors began swirling. The sudden rise sparked jealousy, suspicion, and even sabotage from rivals who couldn't believe someone from their background could rise so fast without help. Whispers of industry plants surfaced, with critics claiming their success must have been manufactured. Others speculated about secret deals or hidden sponsors pulling strings behind the scenes. These accusations cut deep, not only because they were untrue, but because they erased years of grinding and sacrifice, reducing their struggle to a conspiracy theory. It was another lesson about fame. The higher you climb, the more people want to drag you down, and often they do it by rewriting your story. Behind the scenes, the pace was brutal. The schedule left little room for rest, let alone reflection. Tours, press junkets, studio sessions, everything blurred together until days felt like weeks. The pressure to deliver another hit, to prove they weren't a one-song wonder, was relentless. Every studio session carried the weight of expectation. Every release carried the threat of disappointment. And though they pushed through with a determination born from their hard past, cracks began to show. Friends noticed the exhaustion, the short temper, the moments of withdrawal. Fame had come like a flood, and instead of feeling free, they felt like they were drowning. Yet even in the chaos, there were flashes of triumph. The first time they performed to a massive crowd, hearing thousands of voices sing their words back to them, it was overwhelming. For a moment the shadows disappeared, replaced by a raw connection that reminded them why they had fought so hard in the first place. Those nights on stage became both salvation and prison, a space where they could feel untouchable, but also a place where they could never escape the pressure to be perfect. And once the lights went out, the emptiness that followed was often unbearable. As the fame machine roared on, betrayals started to surface. People from their inner circle, who had been with them in the early days, began showing their true colors. Some wanted money, others wanted credit, and a few simply couldn't handle the shift in dynamics. Relationships cracked under the weight of success, and trust became a rare currency. Each betrayal added to the shadows, feeding a growing sense of isolation. The artist who had once relied on a tight-knit circle now found themselves questioning everyone's motives. Were they there for friendship or for access to fame? Looking back, the breakthrough wasn't just about music, it was about transformation. The song that brought them into the spotlight also forced them into a world where every choice carried consequences, every word could be weaponized, and every move was judged by millions. The shadows weren't just personal doubts or industry traps. They were the price of visibility, the hidden cost of achieving what they had once dreamed about on sleepless nights. Fans saw the success, but few saw the sacrifices, the compromises, and the endless battles behind the scenes. The irony of their breakthrough was clear. It was both the best and worst thing that had ever happened to them. It gave them a platform, but it also put them under a microscope. It gave them opportunities, but it also brought chains disguised as contracts. It gave them recognition, but it also gave birth to rumors and betrayals that would follow them for years. Fame had come, yes, but it came wrapped in shadows that were impossible to escape. And as their career gained momentum, those shadows only grew darker, setting the stage for controversies that would later shake their world to its core. The moment fame tightened its grip, controversy followed like a shadow, refusing to let go. For this artist, the spotlight didn't just illuminate their talent, it magnified every mistake, every misstep, and every rumor, until the lines between truth and fiction blurred beyond recognition. To some, controversy seemed inevitable, the price of climbing too quickly, the cost of standing out in an industry that thrives on drama. To others it felt almost orchestrated, as if forces behind the scenes wanted chaos to swirl around them. Whatever the case, their career became less about the music itself, and more about the stories whispered behind it, the scandals that erupted in headlines, and the rumors that refused to die. The earliest controversies started small, but they spread with alarming speed. A heated exchange caught on camera at an after-party was enough to spark headlines about violent tendencies. A misinterpreted lyric became the basis for accusations that their music promoted dangerous ideas. Even when they tried to clarify, their words were twisted, dissected, and used against them. The more they spoke, the more ammunition the media seemed to find. Silence, too, became a weapon. When they chose not to respond, commentators framed it as guilt or arrogance. It was a lose-lose situation, where every move fed into a narrative they couldn't control. Then came the feuds, the kind of high-profile clashes that defined careers as much as any hit record. Whether it was with rival artists, industry executives, or even former collaborators, their name became synonymous with conflict. Diss tracks flew back and forth, interviews turned into battlegrounds, and fans picked sides like soldiers in a war. Some of these feuds were genuine, fueled by betrayal and resentment, but others seemed suspiciously convenient, timed perfectly to boost album sales or dominate social media feeds. The line between authentic rage and calculated controversy blurred until it was impossible to tell whether the drama was real or just another performance. But for fans, that didn't matter. What mattered was that the spectacle never ended, and the artist was always at the center of it. Rumors, however, were even harder to escape. Tabloids and gossip blogs churned out stories faster than anyone could deny them. Whispers about relationships, who they were dating, who they betrayed, who betrayed them became endless fodder for speculation. Some rumors painted them as reckless, living a life of excess with no boundaries. Others suggested they were more calculated than they appeared, using chaos as a strategy to stay relevant. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the middle, but in the court of public opinion, nuance didn't matter. A single photo taken out of context could ignite weeks of headlines. A single rumor, no matter how baseless, could overshadow entire projects. There were darker controversies too, ones that tested not only their career, but their humanity in the eyes of the public. Legal disputes surfaced, lawsuits from former associates, accusations of broken contracts, even whispers of criminal behavior. None of it was ever fully proven, but the smoke was enough for many to assume there must be fire. In the world of celebrity, perception often matters more than fact, and for this artist, perception became a double-edged sword. The same mystique that made them compelling also made them vulnerable to suspicion. Fans wanted to believe the best. Critics wanted to believe the worst. Both sides found evidence to support their views in the chaos surrounding them. One of the most infamous rumors involved their private life. Stories that circulated about breakdowns, substance struggles, and nights that ended in self-destruction. Out of respect, they rarely addressed these whispers directly, but their silence only fueled the speculation. Lyrics were dissected for hidden confessions, interviews were replayed for subtle signs of weakness, and every moment of vulnerability was turned into evidence. For those who wanted to see them fall, the rumors were confirmation. For those who loved them, the rumors became a rallying point, proof that the industry was conspiring against them. Either way, their life was no longer their own. It was a stage where every rumor played like a script written by people they'd never met. The controversies also highlighted a troubling pattern: how the media builds people up only to tear them down. When they first broke through, headlines celebrated them as fresh, authentic, and unstoppable. But as soon as cracks appeared, the tone shifted. Now the same outlets that had once praised them began to frame them as unstable, reckless, or dangerous. Each controversy became another brick in a narrative wall that threatened to overshadow their talent completely. The artist who had once been admired for their resilience was now portrayed as a ticking time bomb, someone destined to implode under the weight of their own choices. And yet, despite the chaos, something unexpected happened. The controversies didn't destroy them. They amplified their influence. Fans became more loyal, drawn not just to the music, but to the story, the drama, the sense of watching history unfold in real time. Every rumor became a cliffhanger, every feud a subplot, every scandal a test of endurance. In a strange way, the controversies made them untouchable, because they turned their life into a spectacle that people couldn't stop watching. Love them or hate them, everyone was paying attention. And in the world of entertainment, attention is the ultimate currency. But this came at a cost. The personal toll of living under constant suspicion and scrutiny cannot be understated. Friends described how the artist grew increasingly paranoid, always wondering who was leaking stories, who was twisting their words, who was plotting their downfall. Trust eroded, relationships fractured, and isolation deepened. At times, they seemed to embrace the chaos, playing into the role the world had cast for them. At other times, they retreated completely, disappearing from the spotlight only to return with a new reinvention that sparked even more speculation. The cycle was relentless. Controversy, retreat, reinvention, repeat. Looking back, it's impossible to separate their career from their controversies. They are two sides of the same coin, feeding off each other, defining each other. Without the scandals, their story might have been less dramatic, but it also might have been less impactful. Without the rumors, they might have enjoyed more peace, but they also might not have commanded the same cultural presence. In the end, the controversies became part of their identity, shaping not only how the world saw them, but how they saw themselves. And as much as fans argue about what's true and what's not, one thing is undeniable. The shadows of rumor and scandal ensured that their story was never just about music. It was about survival in a world that thrives on chaos. Behind every successful artist, there's always a circle of people who helped them get there, or at least claim to. For this artist, the inner circle was a complicated web of friendships, collaborations, and rivalries that blurred the line between loyalty and betrayal. On the surface, they seemed surrounded by allies, managers who promised to guide their career, collaborators who swore by their talent, friends who claimed to have their back no matter what. But behind closed doors, the reality was far messier. The same people who celebrated their victories were often the first to whisper doubts when things went wrong. Some friendships were genuine, born in the struggles of their early days, while others were opportunistic, fueled by the intoxicating glow of proximity to fame. In the end, the question that haunted them most was simple but devastating. Who could they really trust? The story begins with the early circle, the ones who were there before the world cared. Childhood friends who encouraged them at open mics, small-time producers who gave them free studio time, people who saw potential when nobody else did. These relationships carried a raw authenticity, but even they weren't immune to the strain of fame. Money changes dynamics, and suddenly, friends who once cheered from the sidelines began demanding credit, compensation and recognition. Arguments erupted over who had contributed what, who deserved a share of the spotlight, who was being overlooked. Some of these friendships ended quietly, fading into silence, while others blew up publicly, feeding into the narrative that the artist was difficult or ungrateful. For fans who had once admired the tight-knit image of their crew, the unraveling came as a shock. For the artist, it was a brutal lesson. Loyalty can evaporate the moment success arrives. As their career took off, the circle expanded, bringing in new faces from the industry. Managers, agents, publicists, each promising to protect their best interests while navigating the treacherous waters of fame. At first, these figures seemed indispensable, smoothing out chaos, landing bigger deals, and opening doors that had once been locked. But as time passed, the artist began to notice a pattern. Every favor came with strings attached. Every promise carried hidden clauses. The line between guidance and control blurred, leaving them feeling less like a free artist and more like a commodity. Disagreements with management turned bitter, with accusations of exploitation surfacing more than once. Lawsuits and broken contracts followed, turning private disputes into public controversies. Fans couldn't help but wonder, were these managers genuinely invested in the artist's future, or were they simply cashing in on the ride? Collaborators added another layer of complexity. Music thrives on partnerships, and some of the artist's most iconic tracks were born from sessions with other rising stars. In those moments, there was undeniable chemistry, the kind of magic that makes fans believe in creative soulmates. But as egos clashed and competition for credit intensified, these relationships often soured. Accusations of stolen ideas, unacknowledged contributions, and behind-the-scenes tension became common. Some collaborators turned into rivals, releasing diss tracks that blurred personal grievances with professional disagreements. To outsiders, these feuds looked like publicity stunts, but for the artist, they were real, raw betrayals that cut deeply. Once again, the inner circle proved unstable, less a safe haven and more a battlefield where trust was a fleeting luxury. Romantic relationships brought even more turmoil. Every new partner was scrutinized by the media, and every breakup was dissected in public. Lovers who once shared intimate secrets later became sources of tabloid fodder, selling stories or airing grievances in interviews. Some relationships were genuine, attempts to find stability in a chaotic world. Others, however, seemed entangled with ulterior motives, driven by the allure of fame rather than genuine connection. For the artist, heartbreak wasn't just personal, it was public, amplified by headlines and social media commentary. The people they let closest often became the ones who caused the most pain, teaching them once again that intimacy in the spotlight carries a price. Perhaps the most chilling betrayals came from within their team. Stories emerged of assistants leaking private information, of friends turning into informants for tabloids, of supposed allies sabotaging deals behind their back. These betrayals fed into a growing paranoia, a constant fear that someone in the circle was waiting for the right moment to cash in on their downfall. Some of these suspicions turned out to be true, confirmed by leaks that exposed private details no outsider could have known. Others may have been fueled by exhaustion and mistrust, but the damage was the same. The circle that should have been a shield felt more like a trap. And yet, not everyone in the circle was an enemy. There were still a few who remained loyal, who stood by them through scandals, feuds, and breakdowns. These individuals often stayed out of the spotlight, quietly providing support without demanding attention or recognition. They were the anchors that kept the artist from drifting completely, the rare constants in a life defined by upheaval. But their loyalty was often overshadowed by the louder betrayals, leaving fans and critics alike to focus on the drama rather than the genuine bonds that still existed. The constant cycle of trust and betrayal left its mark. Over time, the artist's demeanor shifted. Once open and approachable, they became guarded, suspicious, unwilling to let new people in. Interviews revealed flashes of bitterness, thinly veiled comments about fake friends and snakes in the grass. Their music, too, reflected this paranoia, laced with references to betrayal, envy, and the loneliness of being surrounded but still alone. Fans recognized the pain in those lyrics, connecting with the universal feeling of being let down by those you thought you could trust. But for the artist, this wasn't just art, it was lived experience, repeated again and again until mistrust became second nature. The irony is striking. The inner circle that should have offered protection instead became the greatest source of danger. Every time they leaned on someone, the foundation seemed to crumble. Every time they trusted, they were given reasons to doubt. And as their fame grew, the stakes of each betrayal grew too. Friendships turned into lawsuits, collaborations into feuds, romances into scandals. The pattern became so predictable that some fans joked the artist didn't need enemies because they had friends. For the artist, though, the joke wasn't funny. It was a painful reality that shaped their worldview and reinforced their sense of isolation. In the grand story of their career, the inner circle is both a tragedy and a revelation. It shows how success can distort relationships, how fame can magnify insecurities, and how trust becomes one of the rarest commodities in the world of entertainment. It also explains much of the chaos that followed, because the wounds inflicted by friends often cut deeper than any criticism from strangers. To understand their later decisions, the reinventions, the feuds, the paranoia, you have to understand the betrayals that came from within. Because in the end, the greatest battles weren't fought on stage or in headlines. They were fought in living rooms, studios and green rooms, in whispered conversations and broken promises. And those battles left scars that no amount of applause could heal. Behind the flashing lights and roaring crowds, there was another side to the artist's life that almost no one saw. A quieter, darker struggle that unfolded when the cameras stopped rolling and the applause faded into silence. To the public, they were unstoppable, a symbol of resilience, who seemed to thrive under pressure. But in private, they wrestled with battles that were far harder to overcome than rivalries or industry politics. These personal struggles were not only the hidden soundtrack of their life, but also the fuel behind much of their art, the invisible forces shaping every decision and every misstep along the way. Fame has a way of exaggerating everything. The highs become euphoric, but the lows can become crushing. And for this artist, the lows were often devastating. One of the most persistent challenges they faced was the mental toll of living under constant scrutiny. Every word they said, every outfit they wore, every gesture they made was analyzed and judged by millions. For anyone, that level of attention would be overwhelming, but for someone who valued authenticity, it was suffocating. Anxiety became a constant companion, a shadow that followed them from stage to stage and haunted them in the quiet of hotel rooms after shows. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it was often interrupted by nightmares of failure or betrayal. To the outside world, they appeared confident, even untouchable. But behind closed doors, doubt gnawed at them relentlessly, whispering that every success could vanish with the next mistake. The pressure to maintain success added another layer of struggle. Once they achieved fame, the expectations multiplied. Fans demanded more music, better performances, and constant engagement. The industry demanded reinvention, hits that topped charts, and an image that remained marketable. Each demand felt like another weight on their shoulders, and though they carried it with determination, the strain showed. Studio sessions that once felt like playgrounds for creativity became battlegrounds where they fought against exhaustion, perfectionism, and fear of failure. The silence of writer's block was deafening, and when inspiration didn't come, self-doubt took its place. Substance use became an open secret, a way to escape the constant noise in their head. Nights blurred together in parties where the highs promised temporary relief, but always came with a price. Friends whispered about the changes they saw, slurred words, reckless choices, emotional outbursts. The artist never fully admitted to struggling, often dismissing concerns with a laugh or brushing them off with a claim of being just tired. But those close to them knew the truth. The substances weren't about fun anymore. They were about survival, about numbing the pain long enough to get through another day. And yet the more they leaned on those escapes, the harder it became to hide the cracks forming beneath the surface. Relationships suffered as well. Fame made trust difficult, but personal battles made it almost impossible. Friends who tried to intervene were pushed away. Lovers who tried to support them found themselves caught in storms of mood swings and paranoia. The same vulnerability that made their art so powerful made their personal life fragile, and the cycle of connection and disconnection left scars on everyone involved. In interviews, they sometimes hinted at loneliness, cloaked in humor or defiance, but those who paid attention could hear the truth. Behind the swagger was someone who desperately wanted stability, but didn't know how to hold on to it. Family ties, too, carried tension. Fame had changed the dynamic, creating distance where there had once been closeness. Old wounds resurfaced as relatives accused them of forgetting their roots, of abandoning the people who had once been their foundation. At the same time, the artist felt misunderstood by family members who couldn't grasp the pressures of their new reality. Every phone call was tinged with resentment or guilt, leaving them feeling like they no longer belonged anywhere. Too famous to fit into their old life, too fragile to fully survive their new one. Financial success, ironically, became its own burden. Money flowed in, but with it came expectations from every direction. Friends who needed loans, strangers who saw them as a walking bank, and industry players who skimmed off the top without remorse. The constant drain created paranoia, making them question who was genuine and who was simply using them. Lawsuits, bad investments, and reckless spending added fuel to the fire, and though they never publicly admitted it, financial strain became another source of late-night anxiety. To fans, they were wealthy beyond imagination, but behind the scenes, the stress of money was as real as the struggles of their earliest days. Perhaps the most haunting struggle was the battle with identity. The artists who once defined themselves by their raw authenticity now found themselves trapped in an image crafted by others. They weren't sure who they were anymore. Were they the person their fans adored, the figure the media demonized, or the individual staring back in the mirror at 3 a.m. exhausted and broken? That crisis of identity bled into their music, with lyrics that oscillated between bravado and despair, defiance and vulnerability. Fans connected deeply with these songs, sensing the pain behind the words, but they couldn't know how real those battles truly were. Despite the darkness, there were moments of light, periods where they sought help, experimented with therapy, or tried to pull away from destructive habits. Sometimes they succeeded, finding clarity long enough to regain focus and pour themselves into their craft. Other times the weight proved too much, and they slipped back into the cycle of escapism and chaos. These ups and downs became part of their narrative, feeding into the mystery that kept the world watching. The unpredictability of their life made them endlessly fascinating, but it also underscored the harsh truth. They were fighting battles most people couldn't imagine, all while performing under the brightest lights in the world. Ultimately, these personal struggles revealed a deeper truth about fame. It magnifies not only talent, but also pain. It doesn't heal old wounds, it exposes them. It doesn't silence inner demons, it gives them a stage. For this artist, the silent battles were never really silent at all. They were woven into every decision, every lyric, every controversy. They were the invisible engine driving the chaos, the force that made their story not just one of success, but of survival. And though the world may never know the full extent of what they endured, the echoes of those struggles remain etched in their legacy, a reminder that behind every superstar is a human being, fighting battles no amount of applause can erase. Public image is a strange thing. It isn't built by the person at the center of the story, but by the people watching from the outside. For this artist, the public image that emerged wasn't something they designed or even fully understood. It was a construct, shaped by headlines, social media feeds, gossip blogs, and television interviews. It was the version of them the world wanted to see, not the reality of who they were. At times, this image worked in their favor, transforming them into an icon admired for their authenticity, resilience, and daring creativity. At other times, it became their greatest enemy, boxing them into a caricature that bore little resemblance to the human being underneath. The rise and fall of their public image is a story all its own, one that reveals as much about the culture consuming them as it does about the artists themselves. In the early days, their public image was that of the underdog, the raw, fearless voice who broke through against impossible odds. Media outlets celebrated their background, framing them as a survivor who clawed their way into the spotlight. Fans loved this version of the story. It was inspiring, relatable, proof that talent could still beat the odds in an industry dominated by manufactured stars. Interviews highlighted their realness, emphasizing how different they were from the polished pop acts dominating the charts. This narrative wasn't entirely false, but it was simplified, reducing years of grinding and struggle into a neat, digestible arc that made them seem like a hero straight out of a movie. But as fame grew, the image began to fracture. Stories of conflict, controversy, and erratic behavior started to surface, and the same media that once praised their authenticity now framed it as volatility. What was once called passion became anger issues. What was once admired as confidence became arrogance. The same qualities that had made them stand out were twisted into flaws under the magnifying glass of public opinion. Headlines that once cheered their rise now speculated on their downfall. It was a classic case of the media build-up followed by the inevitable teardown, a cycle repeated with countless stars before them, but one that still felt uniquely brutal when they were in the center of. Social media only intensified the swings in their public image. Every tweet, every post, every live stream became a potential weapon in the court of public opinion. Fans dissected their words, searching for hidden meanings, while critics pounced on anything that could be interpreted as offensive or reckless. Viral moments could elevate them overnight, but just as quickly a poorly timed statement or an out-of-context clip could ignite outrage. They lived in a constant state of exposure, where the boundary between private life and public persona dissolved completely. And in this world of instant feedback, the artist found themselves struggling to keep up with the narratives being spun about them in real time. The media's role in shaping their image wasn't just reactive, it was manipulative. Stories were exaggerated, details were twisted, and outright fabrications were published simply because they generated clicks. Sensationalism sold, and this artist's life provided endless material. Tabloids painted them as unstable, gossip blogs thrived on their feuds, and mainstream outlets framed them as both a cautionary tale and a spectacle. Every success was overshadowed by speculation about their personal life, every achievement framed against the backdrop of scandal. The narrative wasn't about their art anymore, it was about their chaos, the drama that kept audiences hooked even when they weren't releasing new music. But the artist wasn't a passive victim in all this. At times they leaned into the image, playing the role the world had assigned them. They posted cryptic messages designed to stir speculation, wore outfits that fueled controversy, and made statements that seemed intentionally provocative. Whether this was strategy or self-sabotage is hard to say, but the result was the same. They remained the center of conversation. In a culture where relevance is currency, the ability to dominate headlines, even negative ones, kept them in the game. Some critics argued that they thrived on chaos, that they understood the mechanics of publicity too well to be innocent. Others believed they were simply reacting, trying to reclaim control over a narrative that was constantly being rewritten without their consent. One of the most damaging aspects of their public image was the way it distorted their humanity. To fans, they were either a hero or a villain, an icon or a cautionary tale. Nuance disappeared, replaced by extreme. Supporters defended them fiercely, painting them as misunderstood, while detractors vilified them, eager to see them fail. The reality that they were a human being with flaws, fears, and contradictions was lost in the noise. This dehumanization took a toll, making them feel like a character in someone else's story rather than the author of their own life. In moments of vulnerability, they admitted that the hardest part of fame wasn't the pressure or the criticism. It was the feeling of being reduced to a headline instead of a person. Their public image also created ripple effects that extended far beyond their personal life. Brands hesitated to work with them, fearing association with controversy. Awards committees overlooked their work, reluctant to reward someone so polarizing. Collaborators weighed the risks of being tied to their name, sometimes backing out of projects to avoid backlash. In this way, the destruction of their public image had tangible consequences, limiting opportunities and reinforcing the narrative that they were spiraling out of control. Every lost deal, every cancelled appearance became another data point in the media's portrayal of decline, creating a feedback loop that was nearly impossible to escape. And yet, despite the damage, the public image never fully collapsed. For every headline predicting their downfall, there was a counter-narrative of resilience. Fans pointed to their unmatched talent, their raw honesty, their refusal to conform. They became a symbol not just of chaos, but of defiance, someone who refused to be silenced even when the world seemed determined to shut them down. This duality, admired and despised, celebrated and condemned, made them one of the most compelling figures in entertainment. Their image was fractured, but it was also unforgettable, and in the end, that might have been the most powerful form of survival. Looking back, the creation and destruction of their public image tell us as much about society as it does about them. We live in a culture that builds people up just to watch them fall, that confuses visibility with value, and that treats human beings as stories to consume. This artist became both a victim and a master of that culture, shaped by it, but also shaping it in return. Their public image may have been distorted, manipulated, and torn apart, but it also ensured they remained impossible to ignore. And in the world of fame, being unforgettable is often the only kind of immortality that matters. Reinvention has always been one of the oldest survival strategies in entertainment. But for this artist, it wasn't just a tactic, it became a necessity. After years of chaos, controversy, and the relentless grind of public scrutiny, the version of themselves that the world had come to know felt unsustainable. They were tired of being painted as reckless, unstable, or broken, and they understood something that many artists never do until it's too late. Once the public grows too comfortable with one version of you, the story ends. Reinvention offered them a chance to flip the script, to take control of a narrative that had spiraled out of their hands, and to prove that they were more than the headlines that had defined them. But like everything else in their career, their reinvention didn't happen quietly. It was bold, polarizing, and impossible to ignore. The shift started subtly. In interviews, their tone changed, less defensive, more self-aware. Lyrics that once sounded like raw confessions of chaos began carrying notes of reflection, even wisdom. Fashion choices evolved too, replacing provocative statements with carefully curated looks that suggested growth rather than rebellion. To casual observers, these changes seemed small, almost unremarkable, but to longtime fans it was clear something deeper was happening. The artist wasn't just growing, they were deliberately reshaping themselves, peeling away one persona and revealing another. It wasn't a mask being swapped, it was a metamorphosis unfolding in real time. Part of this reinvention came from necessity. After years of feuds and scandals, doors had started closing, collaborators hesitated, labels grew cautious, and opportunities shrank under the weight of controversy. Reinvention became the only way forward, a strategy to reset perceptions and reignite interest. And they didn't hold back. Their first major project under this new persona was a shock to everyone, a body of work that abandoned the chaotic, aggressive tone of their earlier music in favor of something more introspective, more experimental, and undeniably more mature. Critics who had once written them off as a cautionary tale now praised their artistry, calling it a rebirth. Fans who had stuck with them through the chaos saw it as validation that their idol wasn't just surviving but evolving. But reinvention came with risks. Some fans felt betrayed, accusing them of abandoning the raw energy that had drawn them in the first place. Others questioned whether the transformation was genuine or just another performance crafted to stay relevant. The artist expected this backlash after all. Change is always uncomfortable, especially for audiences who cling to the version of you that first captured their imagination. Still, they stood firm, insisting in interviews and lyrics alike that growth was not betrayal, and that staying stagnant would have been the real crime. Their defiance in the face of criticism only fueled the intrigue, making the reinvention not just a career move but a statement about resilience. The reinvention wasn't limited to art, it extended to their personal life too. They began cutting ties with toxic figures from their inner circle, replacing them with a tighter, more professional team. Rumors swirled about therapy sessions, sobriety, and newfound discipline, though they never confirmed details directly. Instead, they let their actions speak louder. More consistent performances, fewer public meltdowns, and a newfound focus that felt impossible to fake. The chaos didn't disappear completely, it never does, but it was no longer the defining feature of their story. For the first time in years, the narrative wasn't about their scandals, it was about their evolution. Of course, the media wasn't content to let them transform without interference. Headlines speculated endlessly about whether the reinvention was sustainable, whether the new version of the artist could last. Some outlets framed it as a redemption arc, while others dismissed it as a temporary facade. But what they missed was the truth. Reinvention wasn't just about optics, it was survival. Every decision, from the new sound to the rebranded image, reflected a conscious effort to wrest back control of their life and career from forces that had nearly destroyed them. They weren't running from their past, they were rewriting it, proving that even the most tarnished reputations can shine again with enough determination. The power of their reinvention was perhaps most evident in their live performances. Gone were the chaotic, unpredictable shows that sometimes bordered on disaster. In their place were polished, electrifying performances that still carried the raw emotion fans loved, but with a newfound discipline that impressed even their harshest critics. The transformation on stage mirrored the one off stage, the same fire but channeled, controlled and amplified into something greater. Fans who had once worried about whether they'd even make it to the stage now left shows in awe of their artistry, reminded that beneath the chaos had always been a talent too powerful to ignore. Yet reinvention didn't erase the past, it reframed it. Old scandals were revisited with a new lens, now seen as part of a journey rather than a downfall. Lyrics that once sounded like reckless confessions now felt like foreshadowing, pieces of a larger narrative about struggle and growth. Even rivals and critics were forced to acknowledge the shift, grudgingly admitting that the artist had defied expectations by not only surviving but thriving. This recontextualization of their past was perhaps the greatest victory of all. By reinventing themselves, they hadn't just changed their future, they had rewritten their history. Still, the question lingered: was this reinvention permanent, or just another phase in a career defined by unpredictability? The artist never gave a clear answer, perhaps because they understood that reinvention isn't a one-time event, but a lifelong process. They hinted at this in interviews, suggesting that growth meant embracing change rather than fearing it. And in a way, that uncertainty became part of the allure. Fans didn't know what version of the artist they would get next, but they knew it would be compelling. The reinvention wasn't just about creating a new persona, it was about embracing the fluidity of identity itself, refusing to be boxed into any single narrative. In the end, their reinvention proved something that critics had long doubted, that chaos doesn't have to define you forever. That even after the darkest chapters, it's possible to re-emerge stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever. For fans, it was inspiring. For rivals, it was frustrating. And for the artist, it was liberation. The chance to finally step out of the shadow of their old image and into a future they controlled. Reinvention didn't erase the scars of the past, but it turned those scars into symbols of survival, reminders that every fall can fuel a rise if you're bold enough to keep moving forward. For all the chaos, controversies and personal struggles, one truth cannot be denied: this artist carved out career highs that most performers only dream of. Their journey wasn't a straight climb to the top. It was messy, unpredictable, and often riddled with setbacks. But even in the midst of storms, their talent and relentless drive produced achievements that solidified their name in history. To understand their legacy, you have to look past the scandals and the rumors and focus on the moments when everything aligned, when the world stopped to recognize the magnitude of what they had accomplished. The first major high was of course the breakthrough hit that put them on the map. That single song not only charted, but defined an entire era of online virality. It wasn't just played on radios or streamed on platforms. It became a cultural phenomenon, quoted in memes, chanted at parties and dissected for its raw authenticity. That track alone created a foundation that no amount of controversy could erase. Years later, it's still seen as an anthem, the kind of debut that cements a legacy before a career has even fully started. From there, the achievements piled up. Albums that debuted at the top of the charts, singles that went platinum in record time, and tours that sold out arenas across continents. The shows became legendary, not just for the music but for the energy they brought to the stage, chaotic, unpredictable, and yet magnetic. Fans left with the sense that they had witnessed not just a concert, but an event, something they would tell stories about for years. Critics may have picked apart the artist's personal life, but when it came to live performances, few could deny their ability to command a stage. Awards followed, though often with controversy. Some wins were celebrated as overdue recognition of undeniable talent, while other losses sparked outrage among fans who believed the industry was punishing the artist for being too unfiltered, too defiant, too unwilling to play by the rules. Regardless, the nominations themselves proved that even the gatekeepers of the industry couldn't ignore their impact. To be both praised and punished at the same time is a paradox few artists ever reach, and it speaks to the cultural weight they carried. Collaborations with other major stars marked another high point. At first, critics speculated that no one would risk their reputation by associating too closely with someone surrounded by so much controversy. But as time passed, artists across genres sought them out, drawn to their raw energy and unpredictable creativity. These collaborations not only expanded their sound but also broadened their reach, introducing them to audiences who might never have listened otherwise. The result was a string of tracks that climbed charts worldwide, cementing their status as more than just a niche act. They were now a global force. Streaming numbers told their own story. Billions of plays across platforms proved that, no matter what was happening in their personal life, the music resonated. These weren't passive listens either. Fans engaged with every drop, dissecting lyrics, speculating about meanings, and creating online communities devoted to unraveling their art. At a time when attention spans are shorter than ever, the ability to command that level of engagement was nothing short of extraordinary. Their name became synonymous not just with music but with culture, influencing fashion, slang, and even politics in subtle ways. One of the most significant highs came with reinvention. After years of being defined by chaos, the release of a new era of music, introspective, mature, and deeply experimental, proved they weren't just a flash in the pan. Critics who had once dismissed them as reckless were forced to acknowledge their artistry. Some even admitted that beneath the controversies had always been a genius capable of shaping the direction of modern music. This redemption arc was as much a victory as any award, a moment where they proved that survival wasn't enough. They could still innovate, still dominate, and still evolve. Their cultural impact extended beyond music too. Fashion houses invited them to sit front row, knowing their choices would influence trends for an entire generation. Documentaries were made, some painting them as a cautionary tale, others as a misunderstood genius, but all confirming their relevance. They became a staple of conversation, whether in barbershops, classrooms, or online debate. The ability to remain at the center of discourse for years is itself an achievement in an industry that discards artists as quickly as it discovers them. And then there were the moments that transcended entertainment altogether. Benefit concerts, charity donations, and unexpected acts of generosity reminded the world that beneath the chaos was someone deeply aware of their influence. Fans shared stories of how their music saved lives, how lyrics helped them through depression, heartbreak, or identity crises. The artist's authenticity, sometimes messy, sometimes brutal, connected with people on a level that polished acts rarely achieve. That connection may be the greatest achievement of all, the invisible thread tying millions of strangers together through shared emotion. Of course, these highs were often overshadowed in the moment by the noise of controversy. Headlines about scandals drowned out announcements of new records broken, and gossip blogs often eclipsed critical reviews of groundbreaking albums. But history has a way of clarifying what matters. Years from now, it's unlikely people will remember every rumor or feud. What they will remember are the songs, the performances, and the cultural shifts sparked by an artist who refused to play it safe. The legacy of these highs is clear. Despite everything, despite betrayals, rumors, and personal demons, the artist built a career defined by impact. Their achievements weren't just about numbers, though those were impressive enough. They were about influence, about creating moments that defined an era and left marks on people's lives. Fame may have tested them, broken them, and rebuilt them. But through it all, the highs proved they weren't just surviving in the industry, they were shaping it. And that's what separates them from the countless others who came and went. Looking at their career as a whole, the highs shine even brighter against the backdrop of chaos. Each milestone wasn't just a victory, it was a defiance of the odds stacked against them. Every chart-topping hit was proof that talent could outlast scandal. Every sold-out show was proof that fans cared more about the music than the gossip. Every reinvention was proof that identity is fluid, and survival requires adaptation. These achievements weren't accidents. They were the result of resilience, creativity, and an unbreakable connection with people who saw themselves in the artist's story. In the end, the career highs and achievements remind us why the story of this artist is so captivating. It's not just about the mistakes, the controversies, or the struggles. It's about the moments when they transcended all of it, proving to the world and maybe to themselves that greatness can be messy, complicated, and imperfect, but still unforgettable. Cultural influence is harder to measure than streams or awards, but it lasts far longer, and in many ways it defines an artist more than anything else. For this artist, the legacy they carved out goes beyond their music, beyond their controversies, and beyond the fleeting spotlight of celebrity. They didn't just release songs, they shifted conversations, redefined norms, and left fingerprints on a generation that grew up with their story playing out in real time. Love them or hate them, dismiss them as reckless or hail them as visionary, their impact is undeniable, and that is what makes their cultural influence one of the most fascinating chapters in their saga. One of the clearest ways their influence manifested was in language. Phrases from their lyrics became slang, lines repeated on social media until they entered everyday vocabulary. Teenagers quoted them in text messages, comedians referenced them in jokes, and even critics who couldn't stand them found themselves repeating their words because they captured something raw and relatable. It's rare for an artist to shape how people speak, but that's exactly what they did, embedding themselves into culture not through careful branding, but through the unfiltered authenticity of their expression. That kind of influence doesn't fade, it lingers, resurfacing years later in the way people remember certain eras of their youth. Fashion was another area where their imprint was unmistakable. From the start, they refused to conform to industry standards, mixing streetwear with high fashion, turning eccentric outfits into statements that blurred the line between rebellion and art. Critics mocked them at first, but soon enough, those same styles began appearing on runways and in glossy magazines. Younger artists mimicked their looks, and fans emulated their choices as a form of self-expression. What once looked outrageous slowly became mainstream, proving that their willingness to take risks wasn't just personal, it was cultural leadership. They didn't follow trends, they created them, and in doing so they gave a generation permission to be unapologetically bold. Their influence also extended into the way society talked about vulnerability. In an industry that thrives on polished images, this artist's willingness to bear their struggles in lyrics, interviews, and sometimes messy public breakdowns opened a door for conversations about mental health. Fans who once felt alone in their battles found comfort in knowing that someone in the spotlight was wrestling with the same demons. Critics might have dismissed those moments as signs of instability, but for many they were proof of authenticity, a reminder that even icons are human. This normalization of struggle became part of their legacy, inspiring other artists to be more transparent and fans to seek connection in honesty rather than perfection. Perhaps the most surprising cultural impact was their ability to blur boundaries. They didn't fit neatly into a single genre, instead pulling influences from rap, rock, pop, and experimental sounds to create something uniquely their own. This refusal to stay in one lane frustrated industry gatekeepers, but thrilled fans who craved something different. In time, the genre fluidity they championed became a blueprint for younger artists who grew up refusing to be boxed in. Today, the blending of styles feels normal, but at the height of their rise, it was revolutionary, and their boldness paved the way for others to experiment without apology. The controversies, too, became part of their cultural legacy, though in unexpected ways. While scandals often threatened to overshadow the music, they also sparked debates about fame, responsibility, and the line between personal life and public consumption. Every misstep turned into a case study, every rumor into a larger conversation about how society treats celebrities. Some saw them as reckless, others as a victim of an unforgiving system, but either way, the discussions they provoked shaped cultural attitudes toward fame itself. In this sense, even their mistakes became influential, forcing people to reckon with uncomfortable truths about how we consume and discard public figures. Their cultural influence wasn't confined to fans, it extended to other artists. Collaborators often spoke about the way their creativity pushed boundaries in the studio, forcing everyone to think differently about sound and storytelling. Rivals admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that their presence had raised the bar, sparking competition that made the entire scene more dynamic. For younger performers just entering the industry, they became both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, proof that authenticity could break barriers, but also a reminder of the dangers that come with being too raw in a world that profits from your pain. The digital world magnified their legacy even further. Memes, viral clips, and endless online debates kept them relevant, even when they weren't releasing new music. In a sense, they became more than an artist. They became a character in the ongoing narrative of internet culture. That level of integration into online discourse is rare and powerful, ensuring that their influence stretched far beyond fans of their music into the daily lives of people who might never have streamed a single track. When your image, your words, and your persona become shorthand for entire ideas or feelings, you've achieved a level of cultural saturation that few ever reach. Of course, legacy is never just about the highs, it's about the contradictions. This artist influence is inseparable from the chaos that surrounded them. For every fan who saw them as a trailblazer, there was a critic who saw them as destructive. For every moment of inspiration, there was a scandal that threatened to erase it. But perhaps that's the true measure of their cultural impact. They refused to leave anyone indifferent. Indifference is the enemy of legacy, and they made sure nobody could ignore them. Whether loved or loathed, defended or condemned, they stayed at the center of the cultural conversation, a position that only the most influential figures ever achieve. Looking forward, their legacy is likely to grow rather than shrink, as newer artists cite them as an influence, as fashion continues to echo their style, and as their music endures on playlists and soundtracks. The world will remember not just the controversies but the ways they reshaped art, culture, and conversation. Legacy isn't about being perfect, it's about leaving a mark that can't be erased, and this artist, through brilliance and chaos alike, etched themselves into the cultural fabric of their time. In the end, their cultural influence and legacy boil down to this: they refused to play it safe. They dared to be messy, to be flawed, to be real in a world that demands polish and perfection. That defiance cost them dearly, but it also ensured they will never be forgotten. They weren't just a musician, they were a cultural force, a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and contradictions of an entire generation. And that is a legacy more powerful than any headline, any award, or any scandal could ever define. Every story of meteoric rise carries with it the haunting possibility of a fall, and for this artist, that possibility wasn't just a distant threat, it became an unavoidable reality. The signs had been there for years, the controversies that refused to die down, the betrayals from their inner circle, the endless scrutiny of the media, and the silent personal battles they never truly escaped. All of it built pressure like a storm cloud, and eventually that storm broke wide open. The downfall wasn't one single moment, one catastrophic event that toppled everything at once. It was a series of cracks that spread slowly until the foundation collapsed. By the time the dust settled, the artist who had once been untouchable found themselves standing at the edge, with the world watching every second of the fall. The beginning of the decline could be traced back to an incident that seemed small at first but grew into a wildfire. A public outburst captured on camera, shared online, replayed across news outlets turned into a defining moment that critics pounced on. It wasn't the first time they had lost their temper or made headlines for erratic behavior, but this time felt different. The industry had grown weary of excuses, and the public mood was shifting. Supporters who once defended their passion began questioning whether it had crossed into self-destruction. The video spread globally, sparking endless debates. Was it the cry of someone under unbearable pressure, or proof that the chaos had finally consumed them? From there, the hits kept coming. Contracts were dropped, endorsements pulled, and collaborations cancelled, as brands and industry figures scrambled to distance themselves. Venues that had once begged to host their shows suddenly backed out. citing logistical concerns that everyone knew were just polite excuses. Each loss was another reminder that in entertainment, loyalty is fragile, and once you become a liability, the same people who celebrated your rise won't hesitate to walk away. The artist, once surrounded by opportunity, suddenly found themselves boxed in, their options shrinking by the day. The media turned the downfall into a spectacle. Every headline amplified their failures, every mistake exaggerated into proof of total collapse. Old controversies resurfaced, stitched together with new scandals to create a narrative of inevitable destruction. Tabloids painted them as a cautionary tale, while gossip blogs relished in their misery, tallying each misstep like points in a cruel game. The cycle was vicious. The more they stumbled, the more attention they got. And the more attention they got, the harsher the criticism became. It wasn't just reporting, it was a feeding frenzy, with the artist cast as prey for a world that thrives on seeing idols crash and burn. Financial strain added to the spiral. Years of reckless spending, lawsuits, and poor management choices began catching up with them just as revenue streams dried up. Rumors of bankruptcy surfaced, and though they denied it, signs were clear. Lavish homes sold quietly, entourages downsized, luxuries abandoned. Money that had once flowed endlessly now slipped through their fingers, and the pressure of trying to maintain appearances only deepened the spiral. For someone who had grown up with little, losing financial stability was more than a setback. It was a wound to their pride, a reminder of how fragile success can be. Relationships also fractured in the fallout. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a sinking ship. Romantic partners left under the strain of constant chaos. Even family ties grew strained, with old resentments bubbling to the surface as the artist's struggles became impossible to hide. Loneliness set in, the kind that fame magnifies rather than alleviates. Surrounded by millions of fans online yet abandoned by the people who mattered most, they found themselves isolated in a way that no spotlight could disguise. Their artistry, once their refuge, also began to suffer. The creative process that had always been an outlet for pain and chaos now became a burden. Writer's block loomed, inspiration felt forced, and the pressure to deliver another comeback weighed heavily. Critics dismissed their new material as uninspired, while fans debated whether they had lost their spark or were simply too distracted by personal turmoil. For someone who had built their entire identity on music, this loss of creative fire was perhaps the most devastating blow of all. It was as though the very gift that had saved them countless times before had abandoned them when they needed it most. The lowest points of the downfall were marked by self-destructive behavior that no one could ignore. Reports of reckless nights, dangerous choices, and erratic appearances became frequent, each story painting a picture of someone unraveling in real time. Whispers of rehab surfaced, though the truth was never clear. Some claimed they sought help quietly, others insisted they refused it out of pride. Whatever the reality, the perception was the same. The artist was spiraling, and no one knew if they could pull themselves out this time. And yet, even in the midst of collapse, there were glimmers of defiance. They lashed out at critics, calling out hypocrisy in the industry, pointing fingers at the very system that had once profited from their chaos. In interviews, they spoke with flashes of clarity, acknowledging mistakes while insisting they weren't finished. These moments offered fans hope, a reminder that the story wasn't over, that maybe the downfall was just another chapter rather than the final one. But hope was fragile, and every step forward seemed followed by 2 steps back. What makes the downfall so compelling is the duality of it. On one hand, it was tragic, a painful unraveling of someone who had once seemed unstoppable. On the other, it was almost inevitable, the culmination of years of chaos, betrayal, and pressure. Fans debated endlessly. Was the artist a victim of fame, or the architect of their own destruction? The truth, of course, lay somewhere in between. Fame had amplified their flaws, yes, but those flaws were always there, waiting to be exposed. The system exploited them, but they also made choices that fueled the spiral. It was a perfect storm, and once it began, stopping it seemed impossible. In hindsight, the downfall serves as both a warning and a reflection. It reveals how quickly the industry can turn on those it once celebrated, how fragile the foundations of fame really are, and how destructive it can be when personal battles go unresolved. But it also highlights resilience, the fact that even in the depths of collapse, the artist never fully disappeared. never surrendered completely to the darkness. For all the mistakes and failures, there remained a spark of defiance, a refusal to vanish quietly, and that perhaps is why their downfall isn't just a story of destruction, it's a cliffhanger, leaving the world wondering whether redemption is still possible, whether the next chapter might bring not another collapse but a rebirth. Redemption is never straightforward, and in the world of fame it is even more complicated. For this artist, the attempt to rebuild their reputation and reclaim their place in the spotlight was not just about winning back fans or critics, it was about survival, about proving to themselves and to the world that the downfall wasn't the final act. They had been written off countless times before, but now the stakes were higher. Their name had become synonymous with chaos, their image tarnished by scandal, and their career hanging by a thread. Yet even in the darkest moments, there was a stubborn resilience that refused to die. Redemption wasn't going to be handed to them. They would have to claw their way back, piece by piece, through grit, reinvention, and a defiance that had carried them this far. The first signs of a redemption arc came quietly, almost too subtly for most to notice. After years of headlines dominated by scandal, there was a sudden silence. No explosive feuds, no chaotic interviews, no reckless public appearances. For the first time in years, they disappeared from the daily gossip cycle. Rumors swirled. Some said they had checked into rehab. Others claimed they had retreated to focus on therapy, or even relocated to escape the noise. Whatever the truth, the absence itself was powerful. In a culture addicted to constant exposure, silence felt like a statement. They were stepping back, recharging, and preparing for something bigger. When they re-emerged, the difference was visible. Interviews carried a new tone, less defensive, more reflective. They spoke about mistakes without the bitterness that once defined them, acknowledging the chaos but refusing to let it define their future. For the first time, fans heard them admit vulnerability, not as weakness but as a step toward growth. This humility, rare in someone so often criticized for arrogance, surprised both supporters and detractors. It didn't erase the past, but it hinted at a possibility people hadn't considered before. Maybe redemption wasn't a fantasy after all. The real test, of course, came through the music. Their comeback project wasn't just an album, it was a confession, a reckoning and a promise all rolled into one. The lyrics were rawer than ever, weaving stories of betrayal, regret, and survival, with a maturity that hadn't been there before. Critics who once dismissed them were forced to admit the artistry on display, while fans who had been waiting for substance found themselves drawn back in. The music didn't shy away from the mess, it embraced it, turning pain into poetry and scandal into art. In many ways, it was the perfect redemption move. Rather than running from their past, they transformed it into something that resonated deeply with listeners. The response was overwhelming. Streaming numbers soared, social media lit up with praise, and suddenly, the narrative began to shift. The same outlets that had once mocked their downfall now wrote think pieces about resilience, framing them as a cautionary tale turned inspiration. Fans who had abandoned them returned, curious to see whether this transformation was real. And while skeptics still questioned their sincerity, the undeniable quality of the work forced everyone to pay attention. Redemption, it seemed, was not just possible, it was happening before everyone's eyes. But redemption is never linear, and their journey wasn't without setbacks. Even as they rebuilt, old controversies resurfaced, dredged up by critics unwilling to forgive. Every misstep, no matter how small, was magnified as proof that the change was an illusion. At times, the pressure threatened to drag them back into the chaos they had fought so hard to escape. But the difference now was in how they responded. Instead of lashing out, they remained composed, addressing issues with calm clarity or sometimes choosing not to respond at all. This restraint, uncharacteristic in the past, became another signal of growth. Redemption wasn't about erasing flaws, it was about learning to navigate them differently. Their attempts at rebuilding extended beyond music. They began engaging in philanthropic efforts, donating to causes close to their heart, speaking out about issues they once avoided, and showing a side of themselves that fans had rarely seen. Whether it was supporting mental health initiatives, funding community programs, or using their platform to amplify marginalized voices, these actions added weight to the narrative of transformation. For many, it proved that the change wasn't just about salvaging a career, it was about reshaping a life. One of the most telling aspects of their redemption journey was the way they approached relationships. Where once they had been surrounded by a chaotic entourage, now their circle was smaller, more intentional. Gone were the opportunists and enablers, replaced by a team that valued stability and growth. Collaborators spoke about a new professionalism, describing sessions filled with focus rather than conflict. Friends described a calmer, more grounded presence, someone who had learned from past betrayals without letting paranoia consume them. This shift in their personal dynamics wasn't just symbolic, it was practical, laying the foundation for a sustainable future. Redemption also came through reinvention. They didn't try to return to the exact image they had before the downfall. Instead, they leaned into growth, presenting themselves as older, wiser, and unafraid to acknowledge scars. Fashion choices became more refined, interviews more deliberate, and performances more disciplined. They weren't trying to be the wild star they once were, they were embracing a new chapter, one defined not by chaos but by endurance. The reinvention wasn't flashy or forced, it was subtle, steady, and rooted in authenticity, which made it all the more powerful. What makes this redemption arc so compelling is the tension at its core. On one hand, it is inspiring, a story of survival, resilience, and growth. On the other, it raises uncomfortable questions. Should we forgive? Should we forget? Can redemption truly erase years of mistakes, or does it simply reframe them? For fans, these questions didn't matter as much as the feeling of seeing their idol rise again. For critics, the debate itself was proof of the artist's enduring cultural weight. Love them or hate them, the fact that their redemption was even being discussed showed that they had once again become impossible to ignore. In the end, the attempts at redemption weren't perfect. They never are, but they were real. They showed that even after the most public of downfalls, there is always a path back, though it is steep, treacherous, and uncertain. For this artist, redemption wasn't about reclaiming the innocence of the past, but about embracing the complexity of who they had become. It was about proving that failure doesn't have to be the end, that scars can coexist with triumphs, and that even the most broken stories can find moments of repair. Whether their redemption will endure is a question only time can answer. But one thing is certain, the attempt itself has already cemented another chapter in their unforgettable saga. Every great story reaches a crossroads, and for this artist, the question hanging in the air was simple yet devastatingly complex. Would they reinvent themselves once and for all, carving out a legacy that proved resilience is stronger than chaos? Or would they collapse under the weight of their own history, remembered not for their brilliance, but for their downfall? The truth is, both paths seemed equally possible, and that tension is what made this chapter so fascinating. It wasn't just about whether the industry would forgive them, or whether fans would embrace them again. It was about whether they could forgive themselves, rebuild their own sense of identity, and decide who they wanted to be in the noise. The final reinvention began almost as a whisper. Instead of grand gestures or over-the-top stunts, their approach became quieter, more deliberate. They released music that was stripped down, vulnerable, and experimental, as if to say that they were no longer interested in chasing trends or forcing a comeback on anyone else's terms. These new songs carried the weight of experience, the kind of maturity that only comes from surviving storm. Lyrics that once screamed rebellion now whispered reflection, offering glimpses of someone who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the story. The fans who had stuck by them saw this as a gift, while new listeners were drawn in by the honesty, proof that reinvention didn't require spectacle, it required truth. But reinvention was never just about music, it was about image, identity, and purpose. Slowly, their public appearances became less erratic, more intentional. Fashion choices moved from shock value to statements of confidence and individuality, proving that they could still command attention without relying on chaos. Interviews reflected calm clarity instead of fiery defensiveness, and even their presence on social media shifted from unpredictable rants to thoughtful posts. It wasn't about becoming someone new, it was about evolving into someone who had learned to live with their scars rather than hiding them. This transformation was not without challenges. Skeptics were everywhere, quick to accuse them of faking growth or staging reinvention as a publicity stunt. Every slip of the tongue, every misinterpreted gesture was used as fuel for critics eager to declare that collapse was inevitable. Yet for once the artist didn't seem interested in fighting back. They let actions speak louder than words, choosing consistency over confrontation, a patience that hinted at deeper change. The old self might have lashed out in anger, but this new version quietly proved resilience in the face of doubt. Still, the spectre of collapse loomed large. Fame has a cruel memory, and the past never fully disappears. Rumors resurfaced with every new success, shadows of betrayal and controversy lurking behind each headline. Some former collaborators refused to work with them, branding them as too risky. Industry executives hesitated, torn between the undeniable influence they still held and the fear of future scandals. Even fans, as loyal as many were, wrestled with questions. Could they trust this change? Or was it just another mask that would eventually shatter? The uncertainty became part of the narrative, a constant reminder that reinvention was not a guaranteed victory, but a gamble. Yet within that gamble lay a powerful truth. Reinvention wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming control of the story. They no longer denied the chaos, no longer pretended it hadn't happened. Instead, they acknowledged it openly, weaving it into their art, their interviews, their very identity. The past wasn't a chain anymore. It was fuel, something to draw from without letting it consume them. This shift was crucial, because it marked the difference between collapse and survival. Collapse meant being defined by mistakes. Reinvention meant transforming mistakes into lessons, scars into symbols of endurance. One of the boldest moves in their reinvention came through collaborations with unexpected figures. Instead of chasing mainstream approval, they partnered with underground artists, experimental producers, and even critics who had once dismissed them. These collaborations weren't about chart dominance. They were about respect, about building bridges where walls once stood. Each new project seemed to whisper, "I'm not here to please everyone. I'm here to create." This approach resonated with audiences tired of manufactured comebacks. It wasn't polished perfection. It was real, and in its imperfection, it found strength. For fans, this era felt like closure. They had witnessed the highs, the scandals, the collapse, and now perhaps the rebirth. Social media buzzed with debates about whether this was the true artist finally emerging, or just another phase in a long cycle of chaos. Either way, the engagement proved one thing: people still cared. Indifference never entered the conversation, and in the world of fame, caring, whether through love or hate, is the ultimate currency. But even as reinvention gained momentum, the possibility of lasting collapse remained. Fame is fragile, and recovery can crumble in an instant. One misstep could reignite old controversies. One bad decision could undo years of careful rebuilding. That ever-present risk made this chapter more than a comeback. It made it a tightrope walk, a balancing act between redemption and relapse. And in that tension, the story became even more compelling. Viewers, fans, and critics alike couldn't look away because no one knew how it would end. Legacy hangs in the balance here. If reinvention holds, the artist could go down in history as a survivor, a visionary who turned chaos into art and lived to inspire others. If collapse wins, they risk becoming a cautionary tale, remembered more for downfall than for brilliance. Either way, their story will be unforgettable. Because the truth is, even collapse carries its own kind of immortality. People will talk about it, dissect it, debate it for years. Reinvention offers redemption, collapse offers infamy. Both paths ensure they'll never be erased from cultural memory. What makes this chapter so haunting is the way it reflects the human struggle itself. We all face choices between growth and self-destruction, between learning from the past and being trapped by it. This artist's journey magnifies those struggles under the harsh light of fame. But at its core, it is universal. That's why people are drawn to it, why the story resonates beyond the music, beyond the industry. It's not just about one artist, it's about the fragile line between survival and collapse that we all walk in our own ways. And so, the question remains: final reinvention or lasting collapse? The answer is not yet written, and perhaps it never will be in neat, definitive terms. Maybe the legacy lies in the uncertainty itself, in the tension that keeps people watching, listening, and wondering. What is clear, however, is that the story isn't over. Whether the future brings triumph or tragedy, reinvention or collapse, one thing is undeniable: they have etched themselves into history, and their saga will continue to echo long after the final note has played. When the music fades and the charts stop spinning, what remains is the legacy. And for this artist, that legacy stretches far beyond the boundaries of their discography. Songs may have launched them into the spotlight, but it was everything around the music. The controversies, the reinventions, the chaos, the resilience, that truly carved their place in history. Their story became more than just about albums or performances. It became a mirror reflecting the complexities of fame, the fragility of human nature, and the ways in which culture itself bends around figures who refuse to conform. That's why their legacy is not confined to playlists or award shows. It bleeds into fashion language, mental health conversations, internet culture, and even the way society looks at celebrities as both icons and cautionary tales. One undeniable part of their legacy is the influence they left on younger artists. The ones who grew up watching their rise and collapse absorbed more than just the music. They absorbed the audacity to defy genres, the courage to speak openly about struggles, and the awareness that authenticity, no matter how messy, can be more powerful than polished perfection. Many of today's biggest names credit them as an influence, whether through direct homage in their sound or in the way they conduct themselves publicly. Even those who distance themselves from the controversies admit that the fearless experimentation paved the way for their own freedom to create without apology. In this way, the artist's legacy becomes a blueprint, warning and inspiring at the same time, teaching others both what to do and what to avoid. Their impact on fashion is another dimension of legacy that refuses to fade. They weren't just wearing clothes, they were making statements. From early days of rebellious streetwear to later experiments with high-fashion collaborations, their style blurred lines between underground culture and global trends. Outfits that critics once mocked eventually ended up influencing runway collections and shaping mainstream aesthetics. Fans emulated them, fashion houses chased them, and the ripple effect continues long after their peak. It wasn't just about looking different, it was about embodying a philosophy that style should be an extension of identity, even if that identity is flawed, contradictory, or constantly changing. That philosophy stuck, embedding itself in the cultural DNA of an entire generation. But perhaps the most profound aspect of their legacy is the role they played in reshaping conversations about vulnerability. Long before it was common for public figures to openly discuss mental health or personal demons, this artist was living those battles in front of the world. Their breakdowns, though painful, forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the pressure of fame, the exploitation of young talent, and the cost of living under relentless scrutiny. For fans struggling with their own darkness, seeing someone so larger than life unravel was strangely comforting. It reminded them that they weren't alone. Over time, that vulnerability became part of their mythology, a double-edged sword that both destroyed and humanized them. It's a legacy that lives on not just in their music, but in the countless lives touched by their raw honesty. Their name also became woven into the very fabric of internet culture. Memes, viral clips, and heated online debates made them a permanent fixture of digital spaces. At times, they were reduced to punchlines. At others, they were elevated to mythic status. But in either case, their presence shaped how people interacted with celebrity in the social media age. They weren't just an artist, you could say they were an archetype, a symbol of how quickly the internet can build someone up, and just as quickly tear them down. That digital immortality ensures their story will outlive even the music, replayed and reinterpreted by generations who encounter them first as an online phenomenon before ever pressing play on a song. Critically, their legacy also reshaped how the industry itself views artists who don't conform. In the past, being difficult, unpredictable, or controversial often meant exile, but this artist proved that chaos could coexist with success, that breaking rules could sometimes drive more attention than following them. Industry executives, while frustrated by their volatility, couldn't deny the commercial power they commanded. As a result, the boundaries of what the industry tolerated shifted. More artists were allowed to be unconventional, to push back, to build brands rooted in imperfection. The cost was high, and the artists themselves bore much of that burden. But the ripple effect opened doors for others to walk through. And then there's the personal connection fans feel even years later. Ask anyone who grew up during their peak, and chances are they'll remember where they were when they first heard that breakthrough hit, or how a lyric once felt like it spoke directly to them. That emotional tether is a powerful part of legacy, one that statistics and awards can't measure. Music may fade from charts, but memories tied to that music linger for a lifetime, whether through anthems of rebellion, confessions of pain, or performances that felt like chaotic celebrations. The artist gave people experiences they will never forget. That's a gift no scandal or downfall can erase. Of course, legacy is never simple, and theirs is steeped in contradictions. To some, they remain a cautionary tale. proof of what happens when fame and recklessness collide. To others, they are a misunderstood genius, punished for being too raw in an industry that thrives on polish. Both views contain truths, and that complexity is what makes their legacy so enduring. A simple story is easy to forget. A messy, layered story lives on, debated and dissected endlessly, and that is exactly what this artist left behind. Not a neat legacy, but a complex one full of brilliance and chaos, triumph and tragedy. Even now, long after their most explosive years, the fascination remains. Documentaries revisit their story, think pieces analyze their influence, and new fans discover them through viral clips. They exist in a rare space, where their name means more than just music. It means a story, a lesson, a symbol of both the possibilities and dangers of chasing fame. That kind of cultural permanence is rare, and it ensures that their legacy will outlive even the people who experienced it firsthand. Ultimately, legacy beyond the music means impact that transcends sound. It's in the way people dress, the words they use, the openness with which they discuss struggle, and the way they view fame itself. It's in the influence on artists who dare to experiment, in the internet culture that immortalized their every move, and in the conversations about vulnerability they sparked without meaning to. Their legacy is complicated, messy, and contradictory, but it is also undeniable. And perhaps that's the most fitting reflection of who they were, someone who never fit neatly into a box, someone who left behind a story that refuses to be simplified. Because when the last note fades, when the headlines move on, what remains is not perfection, it's impact. And this artist, for all their flaws and brilliance, left an impact that will echo for generations. That is the true measure of legacy, and theirs stretches far beyond the music, into the very heart of culture itself. Strip away the fame, the scandals, the controversies, and the headlines, and what remains is something easy to forget: a human being. Too often, when the world watches celebrities rise and fall, it becomes entertainment rather than reality. People forget that the person at the center of the chaos is still flesh and blood, still feeling pain, still struggling with emotions too heavy to carry. To this artist, that truth was buried under layers of media spin, fan expectations, and industry manipulation. The world saw an icon, a spectacle, a character to be celebrated or mocked. But behind all of it was a person who laughed, cried, broke down, and tried, sometimes desperately, to hold it all together. Section 14, then, isn't about music or legacy or cultural impact. It's about the human story that existed long before fame and will continue long after it fades. From the beginning, the human side was often overlooked. Reporters focused on the dramatic details, the fights, the betrayals, the shocking rumors, but few bothered to ask how it felt to live through that constant barrage of scrutiny. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your mistakes would be magnified 1,000 times, that strangers would dissect your every move, and that millions of people who never met you felt entitled to judge your character. That weight, carried daily, shaped the artist's entire experience of fame. It was more than just pressure, it was suffocating. And yet, because they projected confidence and chaos, people forgot that insecurity was lurking underneath, eating away at them in private. Friends and collaborators often spoke about two sides of the same person. On stage or in front of cameras, they were explosive, fearless, larger than life. But in quiet moments, they revealed vulnerability that shocked those who only knew the public persona. Behind closed doors, they worried about disappointing fans, feared being forgotten, and wrestled with questions of identity. Was the world in love with their true self, or with the mask they had created to survive? That question haunted them, making every success feel incomplete, as though the applause was for someone else entirely. The public rarely saw this side, but it was always there, an undercurrent of fragility beneath the storms. The human side also included struggles that fame only made worse. Issues with trust ran deep, a product of betrayals from people who claimed to care but only wanted a piece of the spotlight. Relationships became minefields, where love was complicated by power dynamics and financial stakes. Friends turned into opportunists, and opportunists disguised themselves as friends. Every betrayal left scars, not just on their career but on their ability to believe in people at all. The loneliness that resulted was profound. Imagine being surrounded by thousands of fans screaming your name, yet feeling utterly alone because you didn't know who you could trust. That was their reality. Fame amplified attention, but it also magnified isolation. Mental health battles became another layer of humanity hidden in plain sight. While the world watched breakdowns and scandals, what they didn't always see was the pain that fueled them. Long nights of anxiety, moments of despair, and the struggle to find stability in a life that never slowed down. All of it chipped away at their well-being. Fame doesn't offer the luxury of privacy, which meant that personal struggles became public drama, twisted into narratives that sold stories rather than revealed truths. Yet through it all, they kept trying to find balance, even when the odds were against them. Therapy, self-reflection, and attempts to cut out toxic influences were steps toward healing, though never simple or linear. The human behind the headlines also carried dreams that went beyond fame and money. They spoke in quiet interviews about wanting a family, about wanting to mentor younger artists, about giving back to the communities that raised them. These aspirations rarely made the headlines, overshadowed by more sensational stories, but they were real, and they offered glimpses into a heart that longed for something greater than charts and trophies. The desire for normalcy, something as simple as walking down the street without being recognized, was another constant yearning. Fame gave them everything except peace, and peace was what they craved most. Fans who met them in person often described moments of kindness that contradicted the media narrative. They remembered conversations where the artist listened deeply, gestures of generosity like paying bills for strangers, or unexpected words of encouragement that stuck for years. These small acts revealed the human side more powerfully than any public statement. It showed that beneath the bravado and controversy there was compassion, a recognition of the struggles others faced, and a desire to connect beyond the stage. For those lucky enough to experience it, those moments became the truth of who the artist really was. Flawed, yes, but also deeply human. It's important to recognize the toll of carrying contradictions. To the world they were invincible, a lightning rod for attention who seemed unbothered by criticism. But to themselves they were often fragile, questioning whether they deserved the love or the hate, questioning whether they were strong enough to keep going. That dissonance created an internal war, one side craving the spotlight, the other side desperate for escape. This battle defined much of their journey, making them both relatable and tragic. Because in the end, who among us hasn't felt torn between who we are and who the world expects us to be? Their humanity also reminds us of how fame distorts accountability. Every mistake they made was punished more harshly because of their visibility. Every success scrutinized more skeptically. Yet in truth, many of their mistakes mirrored the struggles of ordinary people. Trust issues, heartbreaks, reckless decisions, coping with pain in unhealthy ways. The only difference was that their mistakes played out in front of millions, turning private growth into public theater. Recognizing the human behind the headlines doesn't excuse the wrongs, but reframes them, reminding us that perfection is impossible, even for those who seem larger than life. Ultimately, Section 14 is about remembering that the headlines never told the full story. They captured snapshots, explosive, dramatic, sensational, but they didn't capture the quiet nights of self-doubt, the yearning for connection, the acts of kindness, or the dreams of something simpler. They didn't capture the laughter shared with a close friend, the tears shed alone in a hotel room, or the courage it took just to wake up and face another day under the spotlight. Those moments, invisible to the public, shaped the person far more than any headline ever could. So when we think of their story, it's tempting to focus on the chaos, the scandals, the controversies that made them a cultural phenomenon. But the truth is, the legacy of this artist is also the reminder that behind every public persona lies a human being, complicated, vulnerable, and struggling, just like the rest of us. That's the part of their story that matters most, because it's the part that connects them to everyone watching. Fame may have turned their life into a spectacle, but at the core they were simply human, navigating the same storms we all face, only under a harsher light. And in remembering that, we see not just the icon but the individual, not just the story but the soul. In the end, the story of this artist is not one that can be defined by a single word, a single headline, or even a single era of their career. It is a story of contradictions, of extremes, of brilliance and chaos locked in a constant tug-of-war. To some, they were a genius who reshaped culture, daring to challenge norms and opening doors for others to follow. To others, they were a cautionary tale, consumed by the very fame they chased, undone by choices that seemed reckless in hindsight. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the grey space where most human lives actually unfold. Because beyond the anthems that broke records, beyond the scandals that made headlines, beyond the reinventions and collapses, what we are left with is a portrait of someone who lived loudly, messily, and unapologetically in a world that demands perfection yet feeds on imperfection. Their legacy cannot be measured by charts alone, though the numbers are staggering. It cannot be judged solely by awards, though those accolades mark milestones in their journey. It cannot even be fully explained by cultural influence, though their fingerprints are everywhere on fashion, on language, on the way younger artists shape their sound. Instead, their legacy is measured by the conversations they sparked, the emotions they stirred, and the ways they forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about fame, identity, and humanity. They blurred lines between art and life, between persona and person, until the two became inseparable. And that blur is what makes their story resonate so deeply. It reflects the messy reality we all live in, even if ours isn't played out under a global spotlight. Yes, there were downfalls, public meltdowns, broken relationships, betrayals, and endless controversies that threatened to overshadow their artistry. But there were also highs so breathtaking that they cannot be denied, songs that defined generations, performances that felt like cultural events, moments of raw vulnerability that inspired millions. The balance between those extremes is what makes their story timeless. We don't remember them because they were flawless. We remember them because they were human, because they dared to show both brilliance and brokenness without apology. In a way, their imperfections became their greatest connection to fans, proving that even icons stumble, even legends fall, and even stars can struggle to keep shining. The conclusion to their story isn't really an ending at all, because their influence continues to ripple outward. New artists cite them as an inspiration. Fashion houses still echo their style. Social media still revives their most unforgettable moments, turning them into viral clips that introduce them to new generations. And fans still argue, still debate, still care, because their presence left an indelible mark. Whether people see them as a role model or a warning, whether they inspire admiration or criticism, one thing is certain: they are impossible to ignore. And in the realm of legacy, indifference is the only true failure. They never failed at that. So perhaps the real conclusion is this: their story is not one of perfection, nor is it one of tragedy. It is a story of survival, of reinvention, of relentless defiance against the forces that tried to silence them. They may not have conquered every demon, but they faced them in front of the world, and in doing so they gave a generation permission to embrace their own flaws, to fight their own battles, and to believe that even broken stories can carry beauty. That, more than anything else, is the lasting gift they leave behind. Fame may have tested them, broken them, and rebuilt them countless times, but through it all they carved out something eternal, a legacy that refuses to be erased, a story that will continue to be told, retold and reimagined long after the spotlight is dim. And in that sense they achieved the one thing every artist longs for: not just success, not just notoriety, but immortality through impact.